Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation.
From New York, this is Theater Talk. I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
And I'm the show's producer, Susan Haskins. Hedda Gabler had better watch her back. There's a new conniving monster woman on stage, and she's Becky Shaw, the title character of Gina Gionfriddo's insightful comedy of manners. We're so happy to have Gina Gionfriddo here with us today at Theater Talk. Gina.
Oh, wait, defend that character, first of all. I saw you making
character?
a face there.
Oh, she's not a monster at all. I mean, well, it's one of the great pleasures of the play is seeing the audience take sides. And we did a talk back with the audience the other day, and I said something about that I didn't feel she was manipulative, and there was I could hear men in the audience going, oh, like, come on. So then
But I'm a woman.
Yes, you are.
And I'm saying she's a monster.
You think so?
Yes, passive-aggressive. She is the passive aggression queen.
Interesting, because I feel like she makes people uncomfortable because she's so incredibly direct.
Huh.
That she's like, tell me why you don't want to date me. Tell me why you don't want to date me.
It's clinging and awful and horrible, and you want to run away.
She's a professional victim.
Interesting.
You say we love this character.
Yes. But I mean, how do you feel? I'd ask you, how do you feel about Hedda? Do you think Hedda's a monster?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Susan thinks Hedda should have shot herself after the first 10 minutes of the play. But for those who haven't seen the play, Gina, tell us, who is Becky Shaw, and what is this situation that you brought her into?
The situation is there's a newly married couple in their 30s, and the wife has an adopted brother that she's extremely close to, maybe a little too close.
Too attached to, really, too dependent on.
A little too dependent, a little too attached. She decides she wants to fix him up, and asks her husband, "You've got to find a woman for Max. Find a woman for Max." And he very innocently says, "Well, there's this beautiful woman who's temping in my office. I don't know her very well."
And very innocently he says that, yes.
Yes. Well, so they set up this date, and Becky Shaw is the woman who is set up on the date, who no one really knows very well until they get to know her.
When you say that you don't see Becky Shaw as manipulative, as certainly most of the men in the audience, along with Susan, do, and yet you have this wonderful character in the play, the mother, the matriarch of the family, who's this tough, old, cynical bird.
Yeah.
She recognizes something in Becky Shaw because at the end of the play, they bond, they click, and she's the one who has an understanding of Becky Shaw. And this is not a woman who, opens herself up to really nice, sweet, kind, gentle people.
You know what it is? I think it's a kind of a nuance of language that, Annie Parise, who plays Becky,
wonderful.
Yeah.
She's fantastic. And when we talked about it, she felt that, the difference between Becky and, say, Max or the mom, that I don't think Becky is sitting, imagining moving people like chess, to get
as these other two characters are.
Yes, but I think that she is much more in the moment. I have to be happy. I need to be soothed. One of the things I wanted to get into in the play is that age, and it's 35 for Becky, where people start looking at their lives and getting very panicked if they didn't achieve what they wanted, whether it's a husband, whether it's a job. And I think Becky's got there.
Yes. Well, we should say that one of the interesting things about this play is that you contrast the character Max, who has what everyone would like to have by the time they're 35, a very successful job, a nice apartment, wealth, no girlfriend. But you contrast him with his adopted sister, who, is floating around, trying to become, I guess, studying psychology, who's married to this guy she met, on a skiing vacation, and Becky Shaw, who, has nothing now, who's working as a temp.
Yeah.
This set of characters, people in their 30s who haven't found themselves yet, is this really what was on your mind when you sat down to write this play? Perhaps coming from the art world where you know a lot of people who want to be writers and actors who in their mid-30s haven't achieved anything yet?
Well, it was definitely on my mind. And the director and I went to graduate school together, and we talked a lot, and he lived with me for a little bit in Rhode Island, and we talked a lot about the moment at which your Salvation Army outfitted apartment stops being cool and starts being something you're ashamed of. And it's a very clear moment.
Did that happen for you?
A little bit. Yeah, there came a point when my mother said, I know you think those couches are cool. They are hideous. And I had bought them like from a guy who put an ad in the paper, and they were in his basement in Woonsocket, and they were from the 70s, and they were horrible. But for a little while, they were kind of cool.
And I'm going to interject here, Gina, that you now also work for Law and Order.
So you got better couches.
Right, we think.
No, actually. No, because I'm a miser. My father lived through the Depression, so I'm tight-fisted with money, but that's another interview.
This character's name is Becky Shaw,
Yeah.
and it reminds us all of one of the great master manipulator heroines of English literature, Becky Sharp, and also there are parallels in the plot of Vanity Fair and your play. So talk a little about the inspiration of Vanity Fair.
You know, I hadn't read Vanity Fair, and the inspiration was that I was reading, I think it was a New York Times Magazine interview with Mira Nair, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who directed the adaptation that Reese Witherspoon did.
Yeah, that didn't work right.
And she was talking about, you know, how does an American audience feel about this kind of class consciousness? You know, are they going to get it? Because Becky Sharp is so upfront about, I want out of this class, I want into that class. And I started thinking about that too, that I think it's something we're very uncomfortable with.
Yes.
That we weren't, you know, and, you know, I feel like I saw Hedda, I saw The Cherry Orchard, it's all these places where class is very openly discussed.
I hadn't read it at all, and I'm reading it now because of your play.
We both are running back to it.
Such a wonderful book, and you do capture, you do create a modern version of this grasping, poor person wheedling her way, or not, as you say, into a better lifestyle.
Yes.
You have transposed that desperation into the modern idiom.
Yes, where it gets tricky, and I noticed this seeing Hedda, seeing The Cherry Orchard, you know, it's a different story when women don't have the option to build a career. We do have to ask ourselves, and I think you're right, Susan does say, you know, there's a bit of the con artist in you because you're giving me 2 points that were transformative in your life, and there's 10 years between those poles. And I wonder what was in there, you know.
Yeah, well, Susan, the mother, has a nose for this kind of thing. Yeah. These characters are really so rich and fun and interesting, based on people that you know. I mean, Max, who's driven to make the money, who cannot connect to another woman. Don't look at me. Who's callous and mean and sarcastic and cynical.
We'd have this conversation
We've never met before, darling,
about,
you know, so it's not me. But I mean, rooted in people that you've
Yeah, I mean, definitely, you know, I think that there is a certain kind of male character I write. And I think the voice, it's funny, people I went to high school with have seen the play. I think I went to school with some very, very aggressively intelligent boys. I mean, I went to a school that didn't really have sports. We did, but they were lousy, and our mascot was a grasshopper. And so you got a lot of guys who were not sports guys. They were very, very driven, smart guys. And I feel like I was always bantering with them and trying to get the upper hand. So I think I'm interested in that guy. And I think I knew a lot of him.
Contrasted now with the guy who wants to be a writer, who works in the coffee shop, who is not really achieving much at all.
Yeah, but the thing about him is he's a loser until he publishes a book, and you know it becomes the next great thing. I mean, those people are tricky because people look down on them, but then they come out with the virgin suicides, and then they're like, oh.
He becomes an insufferable jerk.
They come up with Becky Shaw, right, Law and Order, and suddenly the Salvation Army couch is,
it's cool again. Now it's ironic.
Because I'm very curious, when you're a young playwright, what it is like, how you approach this when that Charles Isherwood review appears in the New York Times, the first time you get a rave review. Do you read the reviews? Do you rush out to check the paper on your BlackBerry to see if it's any good?
I read the Times because I know that I'm going to get phone calls, and they'll either be, are you okay? Or, congratulations, and I want to be informed.
Right.
I try not to sit down and read them all, but the thing about the reviews, if you believe them when they say you're garbage, you also, you can't believe them when they say you're a genius.
Right.
If you're going to believe them when they say you're garbage. So you have to take it all with a grain of salt. I'm very grateful, but no, I'm sort of I'm cautiously grateful.
See, we've set you up so the next play, if it's not as good, then they can just like...
Oh, I know. I'm running around telling everyone, you going to stick by me when I drop my bomb? You going to be here for Coriolanus? Are you going to be with me?
That's right. Now, when you're working on a show like Law and Order, which I understand can be quite a grind, I mean, it's a great deal of work, when do you carve out the time to write the plays?
Well, I mean, I've been very lucky. Law and Order's been around so long that it's really a well-oiled machine, you know, so you don't, it's probably not as much of a grind at this point than a new show would be. Hiatus, weekends, it's not easy, and it's probably why I don't have more plays.
Do you write Law and Order at the place?
I plot it there, and then usually it's too noisy. I have to go away and write it, but the plotting is most of the work.
Do they give you the characters, or not the characters? Do they give you the plot and you go write it, or
no? I bring things to the showrunner until he sparks to something.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah,
interesting. And then, is it really true though now, if you're going to make a living in the theater, you have to have a TV job?
I think that. You know, what I think is you have to have a job that doesn't exhaust you too much to write. And I found teaching more tiring than television.
Really? More tiring than doing Law and Order?
Yeah.
Or that you have to have something that gives you enough money that you're not in despair like Becky Shaw and have to go hit on creepy men.
That's just it. And you know when it took a long time to figure it out. I mean, when I was catering, I was so tired all the time. You know, it's figuring it out. And Law & Order's been a good adjunct. I mean, better than that would be just writing plays, but it's not really realistic.
Well, you may be on your way with Becky Shaw.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Get a little Broadway transfer in the works, and suddenly you're out of that subsidized theater, and the money comes rolling in.
Or it would make a wonderful movie.
As Charles,
or a TV series.
As Charles Busch once said to us when he did The Tale of the Allergist's Wife, Charles had spent most of his career off Broadway. You know? And when he went to Broadway with Allergist's Wife, and it was a big success, people were saying, "Oh, Charles Busch is sold out. He's sold out." And Charles said, "You know, I feel terrible. I mean, I'm an off-Broadway artist, and I've sold out." And I said, and then I got that first royalty check, and I thought, if this is selling out, I'm happy to be on Broadway.
Come on.
All right. Well, it's a terrific play, and we wish you great luck with it. Becky Shaw at Second Stage.
Through March 15th.
Extended through March 15th, and I'm sure we'll have a life beyond that.
Thank you.
Gina Gionfriddo, thank you very much for being our guest tonight.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Come on here, Alexander's right.
West 28th Street between 6th Avenue and Broadway is known as, or was known as, Tin Pan Alley, where all of the great American songwriters came out of in the early part of the century. There are 4 Tin Pan Alley buildings left, and they are about to be torn down to put a new condominium there. There's a movement afoot here in the city to save those buildings, and we want to talk about that, and also we want to talk about the history of Tin Pan Alley with our guests tonight. We are delighted to be joined by David A. Jasen, who is the Tin Pan Alley expert. He is the author of Tin Pan Alley, an encyclopedia of the golden age of American song, and welcome to Theater Talk.
Thank you.
And we're also happy to have our old friend Robert Kimball on, who is the expert of experts of all the great songwriters. Bob has written books on George Gershwin and Cole Porter and Larry Hart, and you're about to come out with a book on Johnny Mercer.
That's right.
Well, welcome to Theater Talk.
Thank you very much.
All right, first let me ask you, should these Tin Pan Alley buildings, should they be saved? Should they be landmarked and not torn down?
Absolutely.
Why?
Without question. Because, number one, visually, they represent the turn of the century, the 20th century, in New York City. And nothing else will have any really resonance with any age, including our own, for that. You can't shoot any street or any side of a street in New York that will just smack of the turn of this past century, as those 4 buildings do, especially if they're dressed up properly the way they were when it was Tin Pan Alley, when the professional songwriters all congregated on that block and also on West 29th Street.
And that was really for a very short period of time.
Bob, should these Tin Pan Alley buildings, should they be landmarked?
For me, it's not proven, the old Scottish verdict.
Why?
Because it was only a brief period in the history of American popular music that this was the site of American popular music. You mentioned the great names which have appeared in many columns about these buildings. Berlin and Gershwin. Berlin was only briefly on 28th Street as a song plugger for Harry von Tilzer. He wrote Alexander's Ragtime Band at 112 West 38th Street. George Gershwin worked primarily at Harms at 62 West 45th Street. And of course, as David knows better than any of us, the last great stronghold of Tin Pan Alley was the Brill Building on Broadway, which is still there.
Times Square.
So there are many claims to being the heart of the great American songbook. And I would be hard pressed to think of 10 standards that were written in the 1890s when Monroe Rosenfeld named the street as Tin Pan Alley.
Mr. Tin Pan Alley historian, can you give us 10 standards that were written at the time?
Yeah, sure. Why not? Because they all were from 1894 to 1907. That's a long enough period to establish the area as Tin Pan Alley, as worthy of justification for landmark status.
Yeah.
Because once they're torn down, you're talking about the Brill Building. In 1931 it was built. Who cares? It looks like any 1930s building.
No, I care.
City.
I'm going to disagree with you. I care because that's where Irving Caesar and Edgar Leslie and Bill Handy hung out. Those were those guys whom we grew up with. That's where they were.
But if I understand your point, Dave, it's not just that these buildings were where great songwriters at the turn of the past century were. They are also just an example of what New York looked like back then. No matter what they had been or were used for, they should be preserved because we should at least have pockets to see what New York looked like 100 years ago.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Number one, you have the offices of Jerome Remick. In 1905 to 1918, or 19, they were the world's largest music publisher of popular music. And they started in New York in that very building on 45 West 28th.
And how was popular music delivered to the public at that time?
Well, through theater. And Tin Pan Alley followed the theater up to 38th Street, up to 42nd, up to 45th, and up to 50th Street. That's right. All right? So, at different times. But this was the beginning, and visually, it's so important, I think, as well as musically. Well, number one, I believe also that these things should be turned into a museum.
A Tin Pan Alley museum?
Yes.
Well, we should be in favor of that. A songwriter museum with everybody?
Totally. As long as Dave can be involved with it, I'd be very happy.
Oh, we have a meeting in mind.
But seriously, he makes a compelling argument for preserving it. But what I was trying to say is that stories that appeared about it were misleading.
Yes.
Because they all gave the impression that these great songwriters of the Golden Age were all down there writing their songs down there when in fact they were not.
And
that's what they came later.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think it's important to make that distinction.
But why was it called Tin Pan Alley? And
It was
give us the
called
history
Tin
of it.
Pan Alley because, as Bob mentioned, blowing the whole thing away, Monroe Rosenfeld, who was you.
Me?
You. He was a
theater columnist?
Yeah. He wrote about show business at the turn of the century. And when the publishers, this was, of course, before air conditioning, and especially during our marvelous summers, and for those people who don't live in New York, maybe they'll believe me when I say we have marvelous summers. But without air conditioning? No, it's unthinkable. So what did the publishers do? They had their rooms and the windows open. And what did they play on? Well, if you're a pianist, a professional pianist, and you go into any place, you're going to play on the most abominable, out-of-tune piano that they can drag up. And so, naturally, they had pianos for the songwriters, the composers and lyricists who were hired to produce on demand. It was the publisher demand because their rivals had a new love song or a new topical song or a new something, and so they wanted one too.
But were those windows open? Could they hear somebody tinkling on? And that's
they sure could.
And they would hear the jangle of these out-of-tune tinny pianos, and it reminded him of tin pans because it was noisy, it was cacophonous.
And this was
Monroe Rosenfeld,
the columnist.
The columnist did this.
He christened it
Tin Pan Alley.
Give me a sense of how that music world, that publishing world, worked back then, because this is before radio and television, people got popular music on sheet music.
Yes, they got it in places like Woolworths and the 5 and 10 stores. There were song demonstrators that are hired to do what David was talking about. They would sit in these windows, and they were pluggers and demonstrators, and they would present the latest publications of these writers to the public and to the artists, to the vaudeville artists, to the people who went on stage all over the country would come in looking for new material. They could go to the publishers, they could go to the 5 and 10 cent stores, they could hear it. Music was sold really in the hundreds of thousands and in some cases even millions of copies.
Because at home, but people didn't have phonographs, but they had a piano, and you got out the latest love song or topical number, and you could sit around the piano and play with your family.
Well, you could hear it at the 5 and dime stores. You could hear it in music stores. And right underneath these publishers' offices, you had music stores that they owned and operated and sold their sheet music.
They also did, and this is how George Gershwin got his start, was that he would go around to different theaters where they showed, you know, silent films at that time, and in the breaks, they would the publishers would book a time slot, and you'd have a song demonstrator come out to the piano, and there'd be a shill in the audience, and the song demonstrator would play it, and magically the guy in the balcony could recite the lyrics back to him with the song immediately, and it showed how easy it was to embrace Remick's latest.
And Gershwin did that?
Gershwin did that. His first job was going out there, other than dropping off music at various locations, he would go into these theaters, and he had a buddy named Ben Bloom, whom you've written about, and Ben Bloom got George's job at Remick's. 1914, and out they went to the Rockaways.
And they weren't playing their own songs; they were playing the publisher's songs.
George was playing other people's songs, and Ben Bloom, of course, had memorized them before he got into the theater, and he would magically recite them and sing them back, and the whole audience would say, "Wow!"
That's fabulous. Now, tell us a little bit about, I'm curious, the business of Tin Pan Alley, because these guys, these publishers, were sort of like, I don't know, equivalent of movie moguls of popular music. And the writers, were they getting royalties then, or were these guys just for hire, and it was the publishers who really controlled everything?
Well, they did control the writers, but they did pay them, and sometimes they would give them a weekly advance, but they gave them a certain number of pennies per copy. It wasn't very many, 2, 3 cents. What was it like, Dave? 2 or 3 cents a copy of the sheet music, but the sales were so huge that, you know, when you sell hundreds of thousands of copies of a piece of sheet music, it begins to add up, and that's when it was very useful for these writers. It was an important source of their income. Yes, they also got paid for being on staff of the publishing houses, and that was terribly important.
And then we fast forward where this system kept going when there was radio and records, and still they employed writers to write these things. So when did it fall apart? When did it start to die, that system?
1954.
Why?
Rock and roll came in.
Right.
Elvis.
Rock Around the Clock.
Rock Around the Clock, yeah.
And that was the end of the American popular songbook.
Huge hit.
Yes, it was. But I think, you know, Presley's world, and that changed it and moved it away. By the 50s, theater music was no longer central to American pop music.
Right.
You had an occasional hit out of Broadway.
Right.
But what was central was then the recording artists.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
That happened after World War II. Not before.
Yes.
So sheet music was the currency up until World War II, and then after the war, when shellac became available for commercial use, for records, yes, then record became the coin of the realm.
Who, in the heyday of Tin Pan Alley, who was the most famous songwriter? Whose songs was the country
Irving Berlin.
Was Irving Berlin the poster boy of Tin Pan Alley?
Absolutely.
Great Americans, the great American songwriter.
And what was Irving Berlin's first hit?
Well, his first huge international smash was Alexander's Ragtime Band. But his first #1 selling hit was written earlier, a year earlier. It's called Call Me Up Some Rainy Afternoon. But his first big hit of all time was the great song, My Wife's Gone to the Country, Hurrah, Hurrah. That was his first hit.
Oh, that's wonderful.
He had to keep making up new refrains for that.
But that, I mean, I guess when I hear those when I hear an Alexander's Ragtime Band in an old recording, that is the Tin Pan Alley sound that I'm hearing?
Fine. Yes,
That's
of course.
it.
Yeah.
All right.
Any of his tunes.
Yeah. All right. Listen, David, I'm with you. I think we should save those buildings on Tin Pan Alley, and I hope we made a convert of you.
You have. I'm really, look, David's advocacy of this has gone back many decades. This is not recent for him. And he has advocated and he's expressed it so brilliantly in his book, which I hold up.
Yes, we've got it right here.
We hold up and
You hold up. I'm holding it up the wrong
this
way.
is a wonderful.
But it's a great book, and it really gives you the history of the firms, the streets, and the writers.
Yeah.
So it really is a
It's
wonderful
an
book.
encyclopedia, so it lists everybody.
Fabulous.
It's marvelous. Yeah.
All right, David Jasen, the book is Tin Pan Alley, an encyclopedia of the golden age of American song. David, Robert, thanks a lot for being our guest
Our pleasure.
tonight on Theater Talk.
Glad to see you guys.
Thank you.
Come on.